Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C, and today I'll be taking us through another A&P study session. Today, specifically, I'll be talking about body cavities. So without any further business, let's get right to it. I think the best way to do this is just to start with a webbing activity, where we're just going to draw out what we're about to do in a web. So let's look at it. Two major body cavities, D and V. And we're going to look at the specifics in a moment, but D for dorsal. And we know, based on the last talk, that's referring to the back of the body. And then the V must be ventral, referring to the front of the body. These are the two major body cavities. If that's what you're asked on an exam, that's the answer: dorsal and ventral, two major body cavities. Now, each of these can be subdivided, surprise, surprise, into smaller and smaller cavities. And then when you do that, you can start talking about the name of the specific cavity and the organs that we would find, or sometimes glands we're going to put on the list here, in those cavities. So let's check it out. Dorsal cavity is the easiest one. It breaks into two: CR and VE. CR is cranial, and VE is, whoops, wrong word, vertebral. Vertebral. So very simply, in the cranial cavity, we have the brain. And in the vertebral cavity, we have the spinal cord. And that's all of the dorsal cavity. It's that easy. The dorsal cavity is divided into the cranial and the vertebral cavities. In the cranial cavity, we find the brain. In the vertebral cavity, we find the spinal cord. Now, the ventral cavities are a little bit more complicated. We can still start off with two divisions, TH and AP. So TH is for thoracic. Thoracic, having to do with the chest, and AP is abdominopelvic. Abdominopelvic, having to do with the abdomen and the region lower than it, inferior to it, the pelvic region. The thoracic region can be broken into three parts. Pleural cavities, something called the mediastinum. Some people pronounce it mediastinum, mediastinum or mediastinum. And then the pericardial cavity. So thoracic cavity, the chest, can be broken into three parts: pleural, mediastinal or mediastinum, and the pericardial. The pleural cavities are where you'll find the lungs. The pericardial cavity is where you'll find the heart. You see the word cardia there to remind us. And the mediastinum is in the sternal area. And you'll find things like the thymus gland. And we're going to list those out in a moment. No really major organs there that usually get listed, but little parts of other organs. Okay, the abdominopelvic area, we can just simply break up into abdomino and pelvic, and there will be a number of structures found in the abdominal cavity and also a number of structures found in the pelvic cavity. So in the abdominal, you can think of, your guts, your intestines. In the pelvic cavity, you could think of reproductive structures, but there is some overlap. So now that we know the webbing here, how we can break these apart, let's look at them piece by piece by piece. Okay, here is the dorsal cavity. Again, there's two cavities, the dorsal and the ventral, that show only the dorsal. It looks like at the top here, but the spinal cord would run down all the way down the back of the body. So the dorsal cavity, cranial cavity, and vertebral cavity. The very simple one divided into two parts. Functionally, it protects the nervous system. Cranial cavity protects the brain specifically. The vertebral cavity protects the spinal cord specifically. All this purple and stuff down here, this is going to turn out to be the ventral cavity that we'll see coming up next. Okay, so the ventral cavity is all of the stuff down here that's not dorsal. If it's not brain spinal cord, then it goes into the ventral cavity. But we see it further broken apart, right? We said we could take it and first divide it into thoracic and abdominal pelvic. And the dividing line is right here. And there's a structure in here, even though you don't see it in this picture. There is a sheet of muscle that divides those two cavities out nicely. And in most of my drawings, I'll put a big D here, and that stands for diaphragm. Diaphragm. That's the diaphragm, a big sheet of muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic. Well, let's continue further. It's going to protect not the brain or spinal cord. That's what the dorsal cavity does. This is going to protect the visceral organs, like your heart and your lungs and your intestines and so forth. Thoracic cavity is superior to the diaphragm, right? It's above, on top of the diaphragm. The abdominopelvic cavity is inferior to the diaphragm. Taking them piece by piece, let's look at the thoracic cavity and break it into its three components: mediastinum, pleural, and pericardial. The pleural cavities, and there are two of them, a left and a right, where the lungs are protected. The mediastinum, again, has the thymus gland, tricky gland again, that's in the sternal area, and parts of the trachea, parts of the esophagus, and it could be argued there are parts of other things there too, but mediastinum, we usually think of thymus and some of the tubes coming down that have to do with either eating or breathing. And of course the easy one, because it has cardia in it, peri. Peri is a word that means around. If something is peri, it means around. So pericardial literally means it's around the heart. And that is what is inside of it, is the heart. Thoracic cavity. Three divisions: mediastinum, pleural, pericardial. Down below, we're still ventral cavity, but this is the abdominopelvic cavity. The very larger abdominal cavity with things like the stomach and the intestines and spleen and liver and pancreas and other things too. And then further down, further inferior, we have the pelvic cavity, which would have some of the urinary structures like the bladder and some of the reproductive structures. There are other cavities too. Oral, of course, refers to the mouth. We just saw that root not too long ago. And all of the tubes inside of you, right? All the intestinal tubes where food and dissolved food is moving through are inside of digestive cavities. Nasal cavity, of course, having to do with the nose. Orbital cavities having to do with the eyes. Remember, optic meaning eye, but orbital having to do with the eye socket. Middle ear cavities, which I don't show at all here, except a very strange picture up over this way. But the middle ear is inside of the ear, and there is a small area hollowed out in the bone, a cavity, that lets those structures do what they need to do. Synovial cavities, of all of these, probably this is the most important. You will see synovial cavities, especially where you have large flexible joints, movable joints. You want to try it? Let's play the game. It's always fun to try to label these. So let's start big. Big ones. We know this is dorsal. In the back here, we know all this stuff that's not dorsal is ventral. So that's pretty easily labelable. What else can we do? Well, let's do the easy one, right? Dorsal is very simple. And I know it's just the cranial cavity, and I'll just label it like that for now, and the vertebral cavity. And inside the cranial cavity is the brain. And inside the vertebral cavity is the spinal cord. All right. You could do this over here too. You could say cranial and vertebral if you want to, no problem. Now the ventral part, again, a lot of stuff here, but it is divided into the top portion, the superior portion, and the bottom, the inferior portion. And it's, divided by what we call big D, right? The diaphragm. So I'm marking the diaphragm here. You can see it dividing these two parts of the ventral cavity. So I know that this is going to be thoracic, this top part. And this is going to be abdominal, and this is going to be pelvic. Just like that. We can bring that all the way across. And then, of course, we can take the top cavity, this thoracic cavity, and we can break it into 3 sections. In the middle, we have the mediastinum or mediastinum. We find things like the thymus, parts of the esophagus, the trachea. In the teal color, that's where the heart goes, so I know that's called pericardial. And then the purple ones where the lungs fit, I know that's called pleural PL. Sometimes you might be told about the 9 abdominal pelvic regions, and they are here. And I'm just going to show you where they are, because this is a complete memorize game, and there's nothing really important other that you know where they are. So in the center is a good place to start. We've talked about the umbilicum, umbilical, somewhere where the belly button is, right? The tummy, where the tummy is. And then we have epigastric above it, superior to it, and hypogastric underneath it. If you talk about ribs and cartilage, you might see the word condor to refer to ribs. So under the ribs, hypochondriac, okay, under the ribs on the left, this is hypochondriac, under the ribs on the right. Remember the lumbar region, the lower part of the back where you put your hand for dancing, left lumbar, right lumbar. And the hip bones, even though we called them coxal in the previous slides, you could call them iliac. Also, iliac's a good word for the hips too. So we have left iliac and right iliac. Okay. As usual, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see the rest of the series, go check out the other videos. Bye-bye.